Please join me in welcoming Bill Lind.
Where does all this stuff we've heard about this morning, the victim feminism, the gay rights movement, the invented statistics, the rewritten history, the lies, the demands, all of the rest of it, where does it come from? I would hope that that would be a question that would be at the forefront of the mind of anyone who is caught up in this. When I was listening to our first panelist talk about the discovery that men and women's brains differ as regard to their ability with spatial relationships, I immediately thought of the fact that anyone who's ever gone grocery shopping knows that, because 9 out of 10 shopping carts left in the middle of the aisle are left there by women. If I said that today on many American campuses, I would be hauled up on trial, literally on trial, in a kangaroo court and face some kind of punishment. For the first time in our history, Americans have to be fearful of what they say, of what they write, and of what they think. They have to be afraid of using the wrong word, a word that is denounced as offensive or insensitive, as racist, sexist, or homophobic. We have seen other countries, particularly in this century, where this has been the case, and we have always regarded them with a mixture of pity and, to be truthful, some amusement, because it has struck us as so strange that people would allow a situation to develop where they had to be afraid of what words they used. But we now have that situation in this country. We have it primarily on college campuses, but we have it spreading throughout the whole society. Where does it come from? What is it? We call it political correctness. The name originated as something of a joke, literally in a comic strip, and we tend to still think of it somehow as only half serious. In fact, it's deadly serious. It is the great disease of our century, the disease that has left tens of millions of people dead in Europe, in Russia, in China, indeed around the world. It is the disease of ideology. PC is not funny. PC is deadly serious. And if we look at it analytically, and if we look at it historically, we quickly find out exactly what it is. Political correctness is cultural Marxism. It is Marxism translated from economic into cultural terms in an effort that goes back not to the 1960s and the hippies and the peace movement, but back to World War I. If we compare the basic tenets of political correctness with classical Marxism, the parallels are very obvious. First of all, both are totalitarian ideologies. The totalitarian nature of political correctness is revealed nowhere more clearly than on college campuses, many of which have at this point become small, ivy-covered North Koreas, where the student or faculty member who dares to cross any of the lines set up by the gender feminists and the homosexual rights activists or the local black group or Hispanic group or any of the other sainted victims groups that PC revolves around, quickly finds themselves in judicial trouble. They face, within the small legal system of the college, they face formal charges, they face some kind of star chamber proceeding, and they face punishment. That is a predecessor, that is a little look into the future that political correctness intends for the nation as a whole. Indeed, all ideologies are totalitarian because the essence of an ideology, and I would note that conservatism correctly understood is not an ideology, but the essence of an ideology is it takes some philosophy And it says, on the basis of this philosophy, certain things must be true, such as women are oppressed, and that the whole of the history of our culture is the history of the oppression of women. Since reality contradicts that, reality must be forbidden. It must become forbidden to acknowledge the reality of either our history or our current circumstances. People must be forced to live a lie. And since people are naturally reluctant to live a lie, they naturally use their eyes and ears to look out there and say, well, wait a minute, this just isn't true. I can see it isn't true. The power of the state must be put behind the demand to live a lie. And that is why an ideology invariably creates a totalitarian state. Second, the cultural Marxism of political correctness, like economic Marxism, has a single-factor explanation of history. Economic Marxism says that all of history is determined by ownership of the means of production. Cultural Marxism of political correctness says that all history is determined by power. Which groups, defined in terms of race, sex, etc., have power over which other groups. Nothing else matters. And all literature, indeed, is about that. Everything in the past is about that one thing. Third, just as in classical economic Marxism, certain groups, workers and peasants, are a priori good, and certain groups, the bourgeoisie, capital owners, are evil. So in the cultural Marxism of political correctness, certain groups are good. Feminist women, only feminist women. Non-feminist women are deemed, by the way, not to exist. Blacks, Hispanics, homosexuals, various other groups are determined to be victims and therefore automatically good, regardless of what any of them do. And similarly, white males are determined automatically to be evil. They are the equivalent of the bourgeoisie in economic Marxism. Both economic and cultural Marxism rely on expropriation. When the classical Marxists, the communists, took over a country like Russia, they expropriated the bourgeoisie. They took away their property. Similarly, when the cultural Marxists take over a university campus or something else, including a society as a whole, they expropriate through things like quotas for admissions. When a white student with superior qualifications is denied admittance to a college in favor of a black or Hispanic who is not as well qualified, the white student is expropriated. And indeed, affirmative action in our whole society today is a system of expropriation. White companies, white-owned companies don't get a contract because the contract is reserved for a company owned by, say, Hispanics or women. So expropriation is a principal tool of both forms of Marxism. And finally, both have a method of analysis that automatically gives the answer they want. For the classical Marxist, it's Marxist economics. For the cultural Marxists, it is deconstruction. Deconstruction essentially takes any text, removes all the meaning from it, and then reinserts whatever meaning they desire. So that we find, for example, that all of Shakespeare is about the suppression of women, or the Bible is really about race and gender. All of these texts simply become grist for the mill that prove, quote unquote, that all of history, again, is about which groups have power over which other groups. So the parallels are very evident between the classical Marxism that we're familiar with in the old Soviet Union and the cultural Marxism that we see today as political correctness. But the parallels are not accidental. The parallels did not come from nothing. The fact of the matter is that political correctness has a history, a much longer history than anyone, that very many people are aware of outside a small group of academics who have studied this. And the history goes back, as I said, to World War I, as do so many of the pathologies that are today bringing our society and indeed our culture down. Marxist theory said that when the general European war came, as it did come in Europe in 1914, that the working class throughout Europe would rise up and overthrow their governments, the bourgeois governments, because the workers had more in common with each other across national boundaries than they had in common with the bourgeoisie and the ruling class in their own country. Well, 1914 came, and it didn't happen. Throughout Europe, the workers rallied to their flag and happily marched off to fight each other. The Kaiser shook hands with the leader of the then Marxist Social Democratic Party in Germany and said, "There are no parties now, there are only Germans." And this happened in every country in Europe. So something was wrong. Marxists knew by definition it couldn't be the theory. In 1917, they finally get a Marxist coup in Russia, and it looks like the theory is working. But then it stalls again. It doesn't spread. And when attempts are made to spread it immediately after the war, with the Spartacist uprising in Berlin, with the Bellicon government in Hungary, with the Munich Soviet, the workers don't support them. So the Marxists had a problem, and two Marxist theorists went to work on it, Antonio Gramsci in Italy and Georg Lukács in Hungary. Gramsci said that the workers can never see their true class interest as defined by Marxism until they are freed from Western culture and particularly from the Christian religion, that they are blinded by culture and religion to their true class interests. Lukács, who was considered the most brilliant Marxist theorist since Marx himself, said in 1919, "Who will save us from Western civilization?" He also theorized that the great obstacle to the creation of a Marxist paradise was the culture. It was Western civilization itself. And he gets a chance to put his ideas into practice, because when the homegrown Bolshevik Bellicon government is established in Hungary in 1919, he becomes deputy commissar for culture. And the first thing he did was introduce sex education into the Hungarian schools. That ensured, by the way, that the workers would not support the Bellicon government, because the Hungarian people looked at this aghast, workers as well as anyone else. But he already had made the connection that today many of us are still surprised by, that we would consider the latest thing. In 1923, in Germany, a think tank is established that takes on the role of translating Marxism from economic into cultural terms, that creates political correctness as we know it today, and that essentially has created the basis for it by the end of the 1930s. This comes about because the young, very wealthy son of a millionaire German trader, a fellow named Felix Weil, has become a Marxist, and he has lots of money to spend. And he is disturbed by the divisions among the Marxists. So he sponsors something called the First Marxist Work Week, when he brings Lukács and many of the key German thinkers together for a week of working on the differences within Marxism. And then he says what we need is a think tank. Washington's full of think tanks today. We think of those as very modern. In fact, they go back quite a ways. He endows an institute associated with Frankfurt University, established in 1923, that was originally to be known as the Institute for Marxism. But the people behind it decided at the beginning, in a tendency that now is very clear in political correctness as a whole, that it was not to their advantage to be openly identified as Marxists. The last thing political correctness wants is for people to figure out that it's a form of Marxism. So they instead name it the Institut für Sozialforschung, the Institute for Social Research. Weil is very clear about his goals here. In 1971, he wrote to Martin Jay, the author of a principal book on the Frankfurt School, as the Institute for Social Research it soon becomes known as informally. He said, quote, "I wanted the Institute to become known and perhaps famous due to its contributions to Marxism." Well, he was successful.